our destination for the day is the archaeological site in the village of Bhitargaon, well known for its brick temple and famed terracotta art, which had once embellished the region's history and defined its rich artistic traditions. Bhitargaon is situated in the Kanpur district of the state of Uttar Pradesh in India. Bhitargaon had once formed the heart of an ancient city called Pushpur or Phulpur, whose suburbs half a mile to the east were called Bhitargaon, and the area encompassing these villages was commonly referred to as Bahri Vikri. During the monsoons, this region would transform into an islander's retreat necklaced by the glistening waters of the river Rhind. The temple at Bhitargaon is rightly called as a splendor in bricks, and compared to its bustling surroundings, this ancient temple, which was once dedicated to the worship of Bhagwan Vishnu, is an oasis of delight and meditative calm. The temple compound is a fairly small, square plot of land with the shrine situated in the middle of the complex. Compared to its open environs, as seen in the pictures from the late 19th century, the place is now a teeming center of rural economic activities. Deval, as this terracotta marvel was historically known, was built in the 5th century CE, during the reign of the Gupta dynasty, a period known as the Golden Age in India's history. The Bhitargaon Temple is Triratha on plan with the central projection called as the Bhadra, the projections on the two sides of the Bhadra, called as the Prativadra or Pratiratha. This style of temple architecture was defined by the number of vertical offset projections on the outer surface of the temple, which were called pegas or ratakas. The Triratha temple has one pega or rataka and two kanika pegas or ratakas. These projections were used to give the temple a distinctively aesthetic look, which was further enhanced by the use of molded bricks and terracotta panels of varied carvings and composition. The plan of the temple as published in the British records shows that there was a wide jagti with supporting adhisthana or platform on which this edifice was constructed. But these features now lie buried underneath and are no longer visible in the temple's current form. Texts such as the Brihat Sanhita, Vishnudharmotara, Agni Purana, Matsya Purana and others which deal with types of temples give us an idea of the kind of jagtis that were raised for building temples in earlier times. As per Brihat Sanhita, the height of a temple should be double its width, and the flight of steps, over which the edifice is built, equal to a third of this height. Although the worship of Vishnu had been prevalent in Madhya Desha since centuries, it got fresh impetus during this period due to the royal patronage of the Gupta rulers, who held aloft the glory of the Garuda Dhwaja, and their feudatories. Vaishnavism attracted a huge following of devotees during this time, and many shrines came into existence through the efforts of the devotees and the royalty. Gupta Emperor Samudragupta adopted the Garuda Dhwaja for his emblem and claimed to be the incarnation of the inscrutable being, which has been understood as Bhagwan Vishnu or Bhagavata by the historians. Another Gupta Emperor Chandragupta too was an ardent follower of the Bhagavata belief and took for himself the title of Paramabhagavata. Inspired by the dharmic orientation of the Gupta rulers, several royal houses patronized Vaishnavism and took for themselves the titles of Paramabhagavata and Paramavaishnava. The terracotta art for which this ancient brick temple is famous was one of the ancient crafts of India. Trade in Kaulalaka, things made by the Kulala or potter, and Prakriti, images, on the Uttaraktha route is referred to by Panini in his work. There are also references to terracotta artware being transported in bullock carts and then shipped to distant islands in other texts such as the Jain text Nyadhammakho. Well-organized and prosperous srenis, guilds, of kumbhakars, potters, commanded the manufacturing and trade in terracotta. Demand for the ritualistic terracotta art was driven by the myriad folk festivals and cult worships which were prevalent across the villages and towns of the time. Apart from the religious art, the refined Nagraka class dwelling in the towns patronized the decorative and customized terracotta wares. Some kumbhakars were retained by the wealthy Nagrakas, while others, who were known as Raja Kumbhakars, exclusively catered to the needs of the royal houses and the nobility. Terracotta work on temples and buildings involved a more elaborate and large-scale contribution of the various craftsmen and artists. Such work continued over a long period of time under the patronage of the Brahmins, the landed aristocrats and royals, and involved the Navakamikas or overseers along with the architects who supervised the group of workers skilled in different tasks concerning the construction of both temples and non-religious buildings. These craftsmen, who were retained by the aristocracy and given commissioned projects, were handsomely paid for their art, which stood out for its finer depictions and richer quality of terracotta. The riverine plains, which provided an inexhaustible supply of clay, made terracotta the preferred vehicle of artistic expression. Steady supply of the raw material immensely boosted the production and market of terracotta products. As per Vogel, the decorations on the temple at Bhitargaon are similar to those found on the Nirvana temple at Kasia, which could be dated to no later than the Gupta era and could perhaps even be from the time of the Kushans. This temple is possibly older to both the Devgarh and Bhumara temples and can be assigned a date of construction sometime in the mid-5th century CE of the Gupta era. Much like the other temples of northern India, its destruction was caused by the invading hordes which ravaged the region during the early years of medieval India. The temple at Bhitargaon is known for possessing one of the earliest known vusoya or true arches in India. Vusoyas are wedge-shaped blocks which are placed side by side, as shown in the images, to construct arches. The central block is known as the keystone and the two blocks on either end known as springers. During construction of an arch, the vusoyas requires support from below until the keystone has been set in place. This support usually takes the form of temporary wooden centering. The Jagti at Bhitargaon and even at the Vishnu Temple at Devgarh, which was built around the same period as the former, had wide jagti similar to the measurements given in the Agni Purana. This is another reason for suggesting that the Shikhara of the temple at Bhitargaon was much higher than what its present form indicates. Moldings of the Vedibandha. Above the Vedibandha is the Janga, composed of bhadras and karnas, both with rectangular niches displaying terracotta panels depicting themes from the Ramayana and the Puranas. Each of the bhadras on the western, northern and southern walls of the temple has a set of 3 niches on the front and 2 on side corners. The niches on the 2 karmas vary in alignment with that of the bhadras. The temple's janga is decorated with sunken rectangular niches containing terracotta figures separated by ornate pilasters. The kapotpali is surmounted by a rupakanta embellished with rectangular terracotta friezes framed by bands showing checker pattern. The friezes show pakralata and hrgas. Various moldings on the janga. Each pilaster shows an exquisitely ornate gata base, a shaft with square, octagonal, circular sections surmounted by a stylized inverted lotus, and spirally twisted garland, gata, and a pair of falcars carved with palmettes. There are 4 pilasters on each bhadra and 2 on each karna face. The pilasters interrupt a frieze of stepped triangles and support a heavy kapotpali with 2 karna moldings beneath, the upper carved with reversed kapisyasaka, the lower with lotus petals. Pilaster motifs and moldings. The south bhadras niches harbor images of Gajieso Samhramti, standing gun, and seated Mahvara. The north bhadra shows Vishnu killing Madhukaitva, Durga killing Sumva and Naisumva, and a 4-armed god seated with Angaj, perhaps representing Krishna and Balram. The west bhadra, Bhvaha and standing Astavuja Vishnu. The third niche is empty. During the Gupta age, the appeal of Vaishnavism among the people greatly popularized the worship of the various avatars of Bhagwan Vishnu. We find mention of the avatars in sections of the Mahabharata which lists the Varaha, Vaman, Narsimha, Vasudev Krishna, Bhargava, Dasrati, Hamsa, Koma, Matsya and Kalki as the 10 or Dashavatars. Among all the avatars, the worship of the Varaha avatar was especially popular during the Gupta era, whose legend even finds mention in the later Vedic literature. In the Taittiriya Aranyaka, there's the account of a black boar, Varaha, lifting the earth from the waters on the strength of his 100 arms. View of the niches and the terracotta art housed in them. The Shikhara of the temple is decorated with niches of varying sizes. These niches were used to house bas-relief panels, some of which can still be seen in situ. A variety of themes from the Ramayana, Ravana begging alms of Ma Sita, the Krishna Leela, Kuvalpidvada, Aristasovada, and other religious accounts, Nara Narayana, Ganesha with sweets pursued by a gun, were represented on terracotta panels which were housed in these niches. The preponderance of Vaishnava images on the Janga may indicate that the temple was once dedicated to the worship of Bhagwan Vishnu. On one of the terracotta panels taken from the temple site and now housed in the Indian Museum, Kolkata, is depicted Lord Vishnu reclining on Nagar. This depiction is known as the Seisha or the Sayanamurti of Vishnu and was a recurrent iconographic theme during the Gupta era. In this portrayal, besides Vishnu, Brahma is shown seated on a lotus stalk originating from the navel of Lord Vishnu. The scene is completed with Devas and Asuras hovering around the Lord. In this plaque, Madhu and Kite are depicted armed with maces facing Bhagwan Vishnu. Seisha Vishnu depicted on a terracotta plaque. On both the sides of the porch are terracotta panels depicting Devis Ganga and Yamuna. The panel on the right represents Devi Ganga on a makra flanked by two smaller female figures. One of the female figures is shown holding a parasol over the goddess, who, it is assumed from the lotus on the upper portion of the panel, was originally depicted by the artist as holding a lotus stalk in her right hand. The panel representing Yamuna is completely defaced except for the parasol, which can still be seen on the upper part. The temple at Bhitargaon was built on a raised platform with cell foundation like the temples found in the erstwhile central provinces. Its brick arches both inside and outside the sanctum were supported by stone beams and lintels. The temple in its original form had a projecting portico, entrance hall, or ardhamandapa with a series of steps leading to a small ante-room called the Antarala, from which a passage opened into the sanctum or the garbhagriha. Like the garbhagriha, the ardhamandapa was roofed internally by a corbelled brick dome. The passage and steps were roofed by Vallavi wagon vaults. These roofs were built using the indigenous technique of kadlikana. When Cunningham first visited the site, he observed that although a portion of the original structure had remained, the outer arch, which would have once graced the entrance steps, had faced damage and fallen down. Frontal view of the temple superstructure. A possible reason suggested for the collapse of the ardhamandapa or the porch was the removal of the stone doorframe which had supported the mass of brickwork, thus rendering the structure vulnerable to damage. The east-facing temple today has a flight of 6 steps which opens onto a platform that leads to the garbhagriha. Since its once enshrined deity, the inner sanctum is now simply an empty room. Gajalakshmi. In the mid-19th century or few years before the mutiny of 1857, the Shikhara of the temple was struck down by lightning, which not only damaged the topmost part of the superstructure, but also exposed a vault-like room which had formed the first story of the temple. At the time of the Islamic invasions, many buildings and temples of northern India, like the Sun Temple at Multan, the famous shrine of Jagsama at Thanesa, temples at Sankisa, Kozambai, Shravasti, Bilsar and Garva and more were made of bricks and decorated with terracotta panels in alto relicos. Paucity of stones as well as their higher cost made the builders and patrons of art choose bricks over stones, as can be seen in the temples of Bodh Gaya, Nalanda and even in the temples of Bengal. Discovery of molded and carved bricks in and around Mathura and Varanasi, with stone quarries of Rupbaz and Chunar within reach, is indicative of how bricks had become a preferred vehicle of artistic expression in those days despite the availability of stones within easy distance. 500 feet from the Deval temple, Cunningham had discovered an old mound of ruins covered with bricks and broken figures which he identified as remains of another ancient temple which had once stood at the spot and to which the locals now referred as the Temple of Nagar. As per Cunningham, this name was perhaps derived from the snake which canopied one of the several broken figures that had been dug out of the ruins. This figure was a two-armed standing male, Deva, sculpture with a snake's undulated body at its back forming a canopy. Excavations at the place brought to light numerous carved bricks which had belonged to the cornices and pilasters of the temple. Having dimensions identical to those of the still standing nearby Vishnu temple, these bricks were used towards its repair. It is quite possible these two temples, and perhaps more, had once formed part of a large temple complex of which only the Vishnu temple now survives. Several of the terracotta panels of the Bhitargaon temple were taken away from the site during the initial surveys for display in the various museums of the country. Of those that can still be seen on the temple, I have shared here a few pictures taken on my visit. Top portion of the temple. Although considerably restored, the topmost portion of the temple has been left significantly untouched, thereby according us a glimpse of the damaged yet original pieces of bricks of the temple which had once stood here. Looking at this ancient site, one realizes as to what he had meant by those words. This was indeed civilization before us, expressing itself through its art, its beauty, its excellence, its harmony between the material and the spiritual, but most importantly, through its reverence for the sacred to which it had owed its all. If we call ourselves the children of this civilization, we need to make such places come alive by enshrining the vitality which had once resided in them. These sites have a purpose greater than to be just gazed at adoringly and written about. They are where our gods had once dwelt. In their haunting stillness you can almost hear these now silent abodes yearn for their deities. Shrines, of a still surviving culture and people, are calling for their possessions to be retrieved from the soulless museums, and accorded their rightful status. These places tug at your heart with the wish to come alive with the chants of the mantras and the chiming of the bells. When the sweet fragrance of the incenses once again starts to permeate the air, and the reassuring warmth of the many diyas light up these quiet corners, when a civilization finally begins to reaffirm itself by bringing its gods home, the wounds of the past would indeed have healed. Gupta art is beautiful in both its outer form and in its inner inspiration. Beauty and virtue served as the ideals of the age. The golden harmony between domestic life on the one hand and the religious on the other imparted to this art a deep and perpetual attraction. The outer form and the inner meaning were knit together like speech and thought, as the poet Kalidasa has put it. The significance of rivers in the region's civilizational history cannot be emphasized enough. The ancient riverine trade along the Ganga and the Yamuna, and their tributaries, as well as ample royal patronage received during those times, immensely benefited the local populace, who used the wealth and status so earned to establish religious and educational institutions in the region, as well as spur artistic and cultural endeavors. During this period, due to the royal patronage of the Gupta rulers, who held aloft the glory of the Garuda Dhwaja, and their feudatories, Vaishnavism attracted a huge following of devotees during this time, and many shrines came into existence through the efforts of the devotees and the royalty. Gupta Emperor Samudragupta adopted the Garuda Dhwaja for his emblem and claimed to be the incarnation of the inscrutable being, which has been understood as Bhagwan Vishnu or Bhagavata by the historians. Another Gupta Emperor Chandragupta too was an ardent follower of the Bhagavata belief and took for himself the title of Paramabhagavata. Inspired by the dharmic orientation of the Gupta rulers, several royal houses patronized Vaishnavism and took for themselves the titles of Paramabhagavata and Paramavaishnava. The terracotta art for which this ancient brick temple is famous was one of the ancient crafts of India. Trade in koula laka, things made by the kulala or potter, and prakriti, images, on the Uttarpradesh route is referred to by Panini in his work. There are also references to terracotta artware being transported in bullock carts and then shipped to distant islands in other texts such as the Jain text Nyadhammakho. Well-organized and prosperous srenis, guilds, of kumbhakars, potters, commanded the manufacturing and trade in terracotta. The kumbhakars, who catered to urban needs, settled in families of about 500 in separate localities in the nigamas, market townships, or dwargamas outside the gate of the Mulanagra or main town. They thus lived in the suburban localities or industrial villages, which can be distinguished from the agricultural villages. In the agricultural villages, the kumbhakars were one of the 5 craftsmen who satisfied the local needs of the village and rarely produced for the market.